It was cold that day, I remember.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. You may, if you are a devoted listener to the show, first of all, thank you for being that. And you may notice that this isn't our normal theme music. So you are listening to Liz McNichol, who performed live at an effort to save Ireland's Great Hunger Museum at the end of October on a very wet, but I would say joyful and complicated day. And I am so excited. So this is Arts Respond on WNHH Community Radio. I'm Lucy Gellman, and I'm so excited to be here today with Joe McDonough and Turla McConnell talking about those efforts to save Ireland's Great Hunger Museum. So first of all, both of them are members of a group dedicated to saving it. They have, I would say it's safe to say, ramped up those efforts since we first met in October. And I just want to welcome both of you on this beautiful, I feel like spring is teasing us. I know it's not here yet. It's supposed to be 19 degrees by Sunday, but I'm enjoying the sunshine today. So this beautiful, almost spring day, welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy.
So I want to jump right in and just make the most of the time we have together. Joe, you're a former docent at the museum, and I'm wondering, if you can speak a bit about, for folks who say, I don't know what you're talking about when I hear the words Ireland's Great Hunger Museum. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about what it is and why it is such a treasure in Hampden. It belongs to us, and we should be singing that from the rooftops.
Thank you. And it is somewhat unusual. It's a memorial to in the 19th century, perhaps the most tragic event in European history, which was what we call Ireland's Great Hunger. From 1845 to 1852, Ireland's population, about 1 million died, and another 2 million at least emigrated to the United States, Canada, Australia. It was due to a number of things. First, a blight that struck the potato that was the staple Irish diet, but also to the cruelty of British rulers who Ireland remained a food exporter during all this time while Irish were starving, while the Irish population was starving. About 25 years ago, President Leahy of Quinnipiac was the Grand Marshal of the New York St. Patrick's Day Parade. And it happened that was the 150th anniversary of what's called Black 47. 1847 was the worst year of the famine. And John didn't know very much about it. He came back, realized that this was something that deserved more attention, met with an important benefactor to the university, Murray Lender, Lender's Bagels. And Murray Lender encouraged John to create some sort of a memorial. And John's brilliant idea was that it shouldn't be just a solitary statue, as exists in many places, and it's quite wonderful, but rather a museum dedicated to art that also is dealing not just with the Irish Great Hunger, but with hunger, with food insecurity, with oppression, and refugees and people who have to abandon their homes. The museum opened just 10 years ago, so it would be holding its 10th anniversary if we succeed this year, and it is coincidentally the 175th anniversary of Black 47 this year. It's a remarkable piece, and it's the greatest collection of art dealing with hunger, and specifically the Great Hunger in the world.
I want, for folks who may not be familiar with this, Turla, I want to bring you in because I know that you were one of the first and then remained a consultant on the collection as the museum was coming into being, coming into the fore. And I think a lot of folks don't know that the Great Famine, the Great Hunger, was the direct product of settler colonialism and oppressive rule, and the fact that there were tenant farmers who were starving, and there were migrants who starved as they tried to leave. And so I'm wondering if you can speak about that, because one thing that in this fight that has really grabbed me by surprise is the attention that has been paid consistently to the plight of folks who are suffering under oppressive rule around the world today. And certainly, Joe, you mentioned Murray Lender. One of the great similarities that he saw immediately within this was the oppression that that European Jews, mostly Ashkenazi Jews, and also other groups who suffered under the Nazis faced during the Holocaust.
Wow, Lucy, that is such a huge, huge question. And it is the heart of the story. And immediately I think about 10 different things. I suppose the most important thing is the writer, philosopher Amartya Sen said that famine does not occur in countries that have a democracy. It's not all about climate change. It's about bad government policy. And Ireland had been afflicted by bad government policy for over 800 years, in that it was ruled by the British government. And through those years, the Irish were kind of huddled off their lands, going back, into the 1600s, but they were huddled off their lands into lands that were not really arable, is that the word? That didn't grow, it wasn't good for growth. And the only thing that could grow there was the remarkable potato. And the remarkable potato, one of our great historians, Christine Keneally, will talk about the potato being the most nutritious of all plants. And the Irish, back in the early 1800s, she tells me they were even taller than they are. She said, because they were so healthy from eating potatoes, because they couldn't grow anything else but potatoes. Unfortunately, in the 1840s, a blight came on the potatoes. So the crops were decimated. There was produce growing in other parts of Ireland, and food was being exported from Ireland, mostly to mainland Britain, England, but not for the Irish people, because then it became a question of money to buy what was there. So you had these huge forces working against the people. And of course, without their source of food, of the potato, they starved. And it's always been one of the strange things for me. I grew up in Ireland. I grew up in Donegal. And when I came to America 50 years ago, I was always struck by everybody's reference to the potato famine, as if the potatoes were hungry. It was the people that were hungry because they didn't have potatoes. But there was always this kind of potato famine thing. And it wasn't until Joe mentioned 25 years ago in 1987, where, what was, I'm wrong there in the date?
97.
97.
Oh, when Blair, yeah.
Yeah. So 25 years ago, at around the time of the 150th commemoration of the worst year of the Irish famine, and there are those who take exception to calling it a famine. They call it the Great Hunger. because famine is more closely associated with issues of climate issues in Africa, India, elsewhere. Well, maybe not so much India. But the thing is that 25 years ago, when the Irish government kind of took the lead of the British government prime minister at the time, Tony Blair, who apologized for Britain's behavior back 150 years ago then. And that sort of gave the Irish government a kind of a permission to start referencing this history. They were always a little bit sensitive about really talking about it because they didn't want it to become another another reason to ignite troubles in Northern Ireland, by bashing the British about that. But there was a sense that now they could claim their own history. So really at that time, and as Joe rightly said, John Leahy at that year was designated the Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Parade in New York. So John, being an educator, made it his mission to speak about it. And also in a funny way, it was the year of memorials. There were memorials going up all over the place. I know I was involved in quite a few of them. And one amazing one is at the Battery in New York City, the Great Hunger Memorial down there, which is unbelievably beautiful memorial. But at a time in America where we're pulling down memorials, these were memorials that were going up to something that was very noble in America's history. I'll just stop there and let you get a chance to say something, Lucy.
Well, so Joe, not only because arts is in the title of our show, but also because it is so much of the heart and soul of this museum, I would love for you to speak a bit about the art that you were interacting with at the Great Hunger Museum. Yeah, let's leave it there. And I will have Harry Droz, who's our station manager, share a beautiful article that Brian Slattery wrote for the New Haven Independent.
Thank you. It's been 2 years since I've set foot in there, unfortunately. March of 2019, the museum closed first because of COVID. But then, unfortunately, the university just decided they were going to let it close entirely. And they were, thanks to ourselves, thanks to Turlo, who helped inspire me as well. The university has backed off what we feared was its original intent, which is to sell the collection off, just and it would be scattered. But I'll tell a little story that I told to Brian as well. I did a tour of the museum for a group, and a friend of mine, as we were walking about, we came to one piece by an artist named Margaret Chamberlain. And this piece is called The Leave Taking. It's about 17 people walking up a gangplank onto a boat. Some are down on the ground. Families are being separated. Others are struggling to climb into the boat. And my friend had to walk away because it was too emotional for him. He's Jamaican. He had been sent to America by his mother for a better life, but without his family, to live with an aunt here. And that's the point. The art in the museum speaks to a universal concern. It's not simply Ireland. It is, I was in Ukraine some years back. There's an exhibit in Kyiv called dedicated to what's called Holodomor, which was a forced starvation of the Ukrainian people by Stalin and by the Russians back in the 1930s, where estimates are from 5 to 12 million people starved to death. As Turlo was saying, that's not a famine, that's a hunger, that's enforced starvation. Food is a weapon by some. We were fortunate, I was fortunate to get the opportunity to go through the museum, to know it, to know pieces, to take tours. And every tour I did, I would find a new piece that would matter. There's a fabulous piece by a woman. It's called The Hunger, by Lucy Davidson, who's unfortunately an obscure artist. She was extremely creative. She was also a poet and a playwright. As far as I know, never married, but spent a great deal of time in the 1920s and early part of the 20th century in Paris. Her piece is extraordinarily tragic. It's a three people burying a child. But if you know it, I mean, as we know, Ireland remains a very Catholic country, though maybe a little bit different than they used to be. They're burying the child clearly in a grave that's unmarked, which means unbaptized. And for a Catholic family, that's the greatest tragedy. And the reason it matters to the people, one of the characters in the painting is carrying a rosary bead. That art speaks to, again, it speaks to starvation and policies that go well beyond what we're experiencing right now. Afghanistan, people are starving. Syria, we know, had the same during when that war was going on. And these are universal. We had an exhibit at the museum. One of the last exhibits the museum had was devoted to what's called a famine in India, when Britain, again, chose to take all the rice from the production out of India in order to feed their troops, leaving the Indian people to starve.
In fact, Lucy, if I could
please.
I'm just so inspired by what Joe has said. And of course, talking about Russia and the Ukraine today, once again, William Faulkner's great line, the past is not dead, it's not even past, where you have this one big neighbor on top of this other one. I mean, it's the same story over and over and over again. But I'm very taken, Joe, you tell a beautiful story about one little boy in one of those tours, and many of those tours, to the point of it not just being an Irish story, this is a human story. We're talking about human rights here. One little boy in one of the groups that you led as a docent, Joe mentioned something that he had experienced, something similar to what he and his family.
I don't recall that. I think it was another one of the docents, actually.
That to me was so powerful when you could have a child, just identify with the images in these paintings and these sculptures. And I think for your listeners, Lucy, that's the thing that I would like us not to get lost in the history and to really focus on the art, because that's what's most exciting to me about this museum, is that many of us have been dealing with Irish history for a long time and very familiar with it, but few of us have ever been able to hear this story artistically, visually told, as these artists have done. And I think that more than anything, and I sent you earlier today, Lucy, a list of signatures of all the artists who are currently displayed, the Irish artists who are currently on display there. And many of those artists are in collections, great collections all over the world. But here they have them all in Hampden, in that museum, telling this story. And that alone is significant.
And if I may, and this is something that Turlo and I have talked about a great deal, the building itself is a piece of art. When you walk into the museum, there's a room downstairs where some art is. That's where there's a video that explains the background of the Great Hunger. But you're in steerage. The ceiling is low. You just plank. There's no light. You're on a boat. You're in steerage. You're traveling to America. when you walk up the stairs, you're all of a sudden you're up on deck. There's bright sunlight that comes in through the windows. The floors are light colored. The walls are all white or light gray. It's a matter of experiencing the trip itself as well. In my case, my mother and father both came over, and probably I know they did in steerage. The experience of the Irish who emigrated during the Great Hunger was far worse. For good reason, the boats that were transporting them were called coffin ships because so many died in transit, in part because they were already sick. But
Just
that's the picture there is that painting, by the way, that you see at the top of the stairs. That is on Gortha. That's Lucy Davidson's piece called The Hunger.
yeah, we're really thrilled to get this. We just got this week. This is a list of all of the artists, the living artists who are in the museum. We have a bunch of really fantastic Irish painters and sculptors from the 19th century, 20th century in the building as well, which are kind of remarkable. The one that your listeners might be more familiar with would be Jack Yeats, the brother of the poet William Butler Yeats, and just works by him and others. But these are all the living artists in Ireland who are all saying that they support our mission to reopen the museum. And right from the top, just each one of them is just this terrific artist working around the world on their pieces. This guy here, the third or fourth one down, Rowan Gillespie, his work in the museum, one of the pieces called The Victim, I call it The Survivor, was the first piece that John Leahy bought, thanks to Murray Lender. And the gift that Murray gave and the Lender family gave to John to start it off. But each of these artists just have, and there are some curators in here as well. We pay homage to them as well for their work. But it's like and it's just a tragedy to think that this museum is closed since before the pandemic.
Yeah,
it's closed. And all of those work is just sitting there wanting, the only thing it wants is people to look at it.
so
To be moved by it.
oh, sorry.
No.
Yeah, so I want to talk about where we are, because we are in a different place with Save Ireland's Great Hunger Museum than we were in October when we first spoke. And also, I will say, as someone who has 2 degrees in art history, I was so offended by the original argument that not enough people were coming to the museum in the first place, because I've seen, and Joe, you spoke about it so powerfully, if the 20 people who Quinnipiac has said were coming through were having a depth of experience that was profound, to me, that's much better than 200 people snapping a photo on their iPhones and passing through. But I won't dwell on how offended I was as someone who has worked in both large and small museums myself. So for both of you, I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners a bit about where those efforts are now and how they can get involved to help.
I'll just start it and Joe just jump in. Well, the good news is that we had the first rally back in October outside the museum on that wet and windy day. And we had, just and you described it as it was a very joyous occasion because we all really cared and so many people came who cared about it. And one of the most significant participants that day was Senator Blumenthal, who spoke beautifully about the importance of the museum and reopening the museum. And he also spoke very specifically about what in God's name is a great university like Quinnipiac doing closing its university. And of course, we know that back then, the university gave its reason for lacking funds and lacking traffic, which we immediately took issue with because my involvement with the museum goes back before it was a museum, when I was involved with just John was collecting items and we were showing them in an exhibition at the consulate in Manhattan. But, so we knew that that was a non-starter. And besides that, Quinnipiac is just, it's just been disclosed, they have a 700 million endowment. This little tiny museum, if it was spending, 400,000 or 500,000 a year, Joe, you have your finger up.
In the last year, the cost of running the museum, the net cost was less than $150,000.
So itty bitty. So we're talking about a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, for a university that has a budget, an annual budget of 500 million.
And the irony is, by the way, that since the museum has closed, it has garnered more attention than it ever did in the prior 8 years, partly because the museum never had a budget to promote itself beyond just staff.
Yeah, it started well.
There's one difference. There's 1 year, was it 2017, I think, when the museum collection a lot of pieces went over to Ireland and toured. And that was promoted. And it had 100,000 visitors over the 6 months that it was in Ireland. Now, I don't suggest that the museum, the location on Whitney Avenue is going to be able to handle 100,000 visitors, but it demonstrates something about what the museum's potential was if it was properly attended to. And unfortunately, it never got the attention, not just under the current administration. I think even previously, there was not much of an understanding of what needed to be done to promote the museum.
Yeah, if I could just step in on that one, I think that the origins of the museum, as you pointed out, it opened in 2012. And, the first couple of years, it was exciting, was interesting. The art was coming together. People were becoming aware of it. And then within about 3 or 4 years, interest in the museum began to waver. And I faulted, it was just, the old administration was beginning to leave and a new administration was coming in. So it was kind of like a dip there for a year or two. And then the new administration came in with, I think, understanding the significance of this, what had begun, because I guess this is the nature of art. When art begins, there's no telling where it goes. And what had begun there in that museum had just begun to really take off. But to bring it right up to today, Lucy, where we are is that over the last couple of months, we being a board of directors who are committed to saving and reopening the museum, not just saving the first thing we did was we petitioned the Attorney General of Connecticut to stop Quinnipiac from selling the artwork because we felt this was a violation against those who donated to the museum, either artwork or money or whatever, but they had no right to sell it. So by getting the Attorney General Tong involved, that's put an end to any problem there. Then the university came up with the idea that they would transfer the artwork. Well, we took exception to that. Transfer it where? We feel that the artwork has already begun where it is. So we wanted to partner with the university and be supportive of an effort to bring it forward along with a great university, because the university also has 2 other entities that connect to the museum, regarding the story. They have the Institute for Irish Studies on the Great Hunger. They also have a collection at the Irish collection at the library on campus, which has parliamentary papers, all kinds of good stuff. So where we are at the moment is we went back to Quinnipiac 3 weeks ago, members from the board of directors of our group, and we presented to Quinnipiac the different possibilities of them partnering with us or taking our support to reopen the museum. I got a letter from President Judy Olian last week saying that our proposal was under review, saying that they are definitely in talks with several others, but we are under review, and we keep making the point that the university should consider us as the way forward, primarily because of what they have already begun to establish there, and we're hoping they can revisit that decision and get with it.
Joe, would you like to hop in at all?
Just, I'm going to go back to something that Turla said. You know, it's like if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, did make a sound. Art isn't meant to be behind locked doors. I mean, it defeats the very purpose of the artists. It was moving to me to see when we first got that letter from the artists. They're Irish nationals, the artists who signed that. It was very moving to me because I knew these names only. I knew Kieran Toohey, I knew Rowan Gillespie, I knew Dorothy Cross. Yeah, I knew of them by their art. I didn't know them, and to see them endorsing what we've been doing was very moving to me, and inspiring.
Yeah, and that is, you know, it's the personalities start to come through. It's you know, it's living art that starts coming through, and I just want to make the point that I believe that Hampden, that the museum in Hampden, is not just about the location in Hampden. It has certainly because of all the publicity, and we've been very fortunate, thanks to people like you, Lucy, who give our story attention. You know, that so many people know about it now, that we see this museum being a center where we can do exhibitions in conjunction with other museums around the world, that we can tell stories, just like Joe mentioned, the famine in India. That was a story that was being told in our museum, that we can be part of this outrage on our planet where 30 million people are refugees, that we can talk to the other part, the other side of that being a refugee, of having to leave your home because of government or food shortage or whatever. And we can talk about the Irish experience in America. We can talk about what America did for those millions of Irish and now their descendants, you know, and how they changed America. This is not just an Irish story. This is an American story.
Well, that actually was going to be my next question. And I do want to read a quote from that gathering in October that I was just so moved by. So this was from Tom Kennedy, who is a retired docent at the museum. And he called the museum a testament to, and this is his quote, the nature of prejudice gone unfettered at the hands of a ruling and dominant class. Sadly, that experience, despite the passage of time, continues to repeat itself today. And I found that so telling because it's true. And I'm wondering if both of you could speak about what is significant and unique about art. I will say there are also research tools for people who want to engage with primary sources that are documents, so not just pieces of art, at Quinnipiac University. But what is significant about art as a teaching tool? And Joe, I'm going to hop to you first. That you can't get in any other sort of document or conversation or dialogue.
Well, first, I do want to stress the docents. There are one docent did retire, but the rest of us still speak to each other on a regular basis. So I like to think of us as just on sabbatical, rather than retired. I'm still hopeful that I'm going to get the opportunity to go back in. There's a piece in the museum. I forget the artist's name. He's on the list. He's one of the signers. Bean, maybe, of a mother and children, and it's taken from an illustration. In the 1840s, there was no photography, so there was a newspaper in London called the Illustrated London News, and in fact, we had an exhibit regarding illustrated newspapers in the museum about 3 years ago, 4 years ago. But it's a mother, it's the illustration from the Illustrated London News was from December of 1849.
Her name, Joe, her name, that lady's name in that illustration, her name was Bridget O'Donnell. I
Yep.
know that because my mother's name is Bridget O'Donnell.
Oh my, yeah, Bridget O'Donnell. Bridget O'Donnell and her children is the way it was captioned. And it was an extraordinarily moving story. But one of the things that was unusual about the Illustrated London News, artists at the time, classically trained artists, didn't know how to convey starvation. They didn't know how to, they would convey healthy bodies. You see art of the time, coincident with the contemporaneous, say, with the Great Hunger. And a lot of the figures don't seem robust, seem healthy. It was unusual for the Illustrated London News to convey a woman in rags carrying two children, one standing by her, all emaciated. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible picture. And it's I think Ms. Behan's sculpture conveys that message again. And it is startling when I would take school groups, particularly around. The children would pick up on it immediately of the difference. We would take a look at another piece called the potato peeler of a healthy young woman peeling potatoes. The only reason you could tell that she was having any difficulties is the patches on her dress. Next to it is the Bridget O'Donnell and her children. And it told the story without words.
There's another, Joe, if I can jump in on that. John Behan, he's a big favorite of mine. I love that guy.
John Behan, yeah,
so
yeah.
Fantastic. John Behan, one of his most amazing pieces is he has done the National Famine Memorial in Ireland, a huge ship, but it's a huge ship and a replica, not a replica, but another form of the ship is up on the grounds of the United Nations in New York. But the ship is remarkable in that it's not about the sails on the ship or cotton or linen. It's their bodies, their skeletal bodies. So it's such a powerful piece that John has created. But on that notice, I just want to, things that are happening today. For example, one of the things that I just read a quote the other day from the photographer, Nan Golden, and she was, as we know, she's leading the effort to remove the Sacklers' names from museum buildings. But Nan Golden said, because that's all about money. So let's just go back to the money thing again. But she says, and I'm going to just read her quote, she says, museums are supposed to stand for something besides money. They have a mandate for education, learning, and beauty. And it's those things that each of the artwork in this museum is. It's the capacity for learning, educating, and just beauty. Just to be confronted by something beautiful that forces you to think from different parts of probably to think from your soul rather than your brain.
Yeah. And I will say you mentioned the nefarious Sackler name, and so of course that made my mind jump to Empire of Pain, which is by the author Patrick Radden Keefe, who has also written Say Nothing, which I think has brought renewed interest to Northern Ireland and to the troubles in Northern Ireland. But Turla, you mentioned renewed interest in the museum earlier as well. And I'm wondering, for folks who still say, I don't see myself reflected in this history, I don't see myself reflected in this group of folks who are trying to save this museum, I am still struggling to wrap my head around it. When you're talking to those folks, especially, take me through what you're saying, because I know that I've spoken to some people and they've said, well, how can I possibly identify with the history of Irish migration? And I've said, actually, there are many ways that you can.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have, it's not, it's not just an Irish story. It's an American story because it's really about refugees, and they could be coming from any nation as they are. And I believe they're even and did you mention to me, Joe, that there were quite a few refugees from Afghanistan in the New Haven area?
Correct.
So they're coming from wherever. There's 30 million roaming the planet. And, so it's really about looking at that. And that's why we got some really nice attention from Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who, really cares about refugees and cares about food shortage and these issues. This museum speaks to the broader issues, but it does it through art. And that family that Joe described, Bridget O'Donnell, even though it's my namesake, you look at that sculpture, you're not seeing Irish people there. You're seeing people. And you're not seeing Irish people and all the other stuff. You're seeing people. It's human
I want
history.
to quote Dick Blumenthal because Senator Blumenthal, when he came in 4 minutes, captured the message of the mission of the museum and our mission to save it and reopen it. But he said, how on earth can in this day and age, when starvation is part of the fabric of the world, unfortunately, again, when there are so many who are trying to escape tragedy, how can the university close a museum that is dedicated to telling that story and telling the story that you can survive? The fact is that the Irish story, the Irish emigration story, is a story of ultimate success.
Right, because it changed the landscape of the country immediately. Well, not immediately, but within about one generation.
And do both of you also find it, because this is, the closure of the museum also comes at a time, I understand that we are in the midst of the world sort of being on its head in many different ways, but it also comes at a time when we are seeing a rise across the globe of right-wing governments in a very scary way. And so do you also see this as a very powerful warning, a very powerful cautionary tale? So Joe, you've been speaking about the possibility of migration and the hope of coming here, but also I think in some of the artwork, I see the terror that we have not only in Syria and Afghanistan, but much of Europe, much of Northern Africa right now.
The tragedy of people trying to cross the Mediterranean is just horrible. And one of the things that you have to recognize is that those refugees are not the poorest of Africa. They wouldn't be able to afford to get there if they were. So they're leaving behind people who are in worse condition, in worse situations still than this. I mean, we are capable of feeding the world. The United States, practically on its own, could do that. But we just need to pay attention to what it is that's going on. And getting back to the museum for a second, I know that the museum can become as successful and remarkable an institution as it was intended to be. I was a docent there, but I was only brought on as a docent in 2017. The museum took 5 years before anybody, Ryan Mahoney was the executive director at the time, realized that you need tour guides. He reached out to the Hamden school system, started bringing students, classes in. The opportunities that the museum has to be a part of the educational foundation of the University of Quinnipiac is extraordinary. Med students, they set up something so that the classes of med students, first-year med students at Quinnipiac's med school, would come for the purposes of seeing art that conveys starvation, that conveys hunger, and to understand it, to understand anatomy in a different fashion. And again, those messages aren't they're not solely Irish. You know, it happens that Willow is Irish. I'm first generation Irish. I'm supposed to identify for the 501c3 my qualifications to be a member of the board of directors. The only thing I could come up with, I'm Irish.
I could come up with a few other things on you, Joe.
We'll do that another time, Trill.
If I could take a shot at that question, Lucy.
Please.
I think art is always about doing two things. It's about shocking you into a realization of something, and it's about giving you hope about something.
Mm.
And I think that's what the museum does beautifully. It shocks you with the images that Joe's described, but it gives you hope in what happened for that particular group of refugees when they found refuge. Key word here is refuge, where they found a safe harbor. And I like to think that the real possibilities of this museum, other than keeping artists busy and engaged and, you know, buying artwork that deserves to be seen, I really like to think that the purpose of this museum is to show hope and to show what a great country this is, America has been. And not to forget that at a time where the country has been lacerated for, you know, for the big issues of slavery, the foundation look what books on my shelf that I got to read. You know, you're going to go through all this stuff. And by the way, I read both of those Patrick Keefe books that are, he's my favorite writer at the moment. I just can't, I wonder what's he writing next, because I will read
yeah, we could have a whole episode where we just geek out over Say Nothing. It's one of my
favorites. I will say that I wish it was just Patrick his book that keeps Northern Ireland in the news. It's Northern Ireland that keeps itself in the news. It's British policy that continues. It's the threat of Brexit that has now created an even bigger mess over there, and that they're dealing with. So these things go on and on. I remember when I was going around, the job that I loved most back in 1997 was that I got a commission from the Irish government as part of their memorializing of the famine. And so I got to tour a group of 4 Irish historians around the United States, talking to Irish American groups and others at various centers, San Francisco, Chicago, whatever, about what Ireland was doing to remember, to commemorate. And I remember one morning at breakfast, I said to these guys, they were great. It was like being with a rock band. They were just so bright and smart. And I remember saying to them, guys, give me a good definition of history. And they said, oh, that's easy. One bloody thing after another.
That's great.
That's great.
So our time is winding down. I feel like we could talk for another 4 hours and still be entertained. But if folks are listening to this and they say, how do I get involved with this group? How can they get involved? And certainly when we share out this interview, we will link to the Facebook group, all of the relevant materials.
I would say at this point, we're in the process of, we've made the presentation to Quinnipiac. We need to have as we move into what I call the high holy days of St. Patrick over the next 3 weeks, we need help. We need funds. I have to, ask for support for our efforts, because everything we do, involving particularly other artists and designers and graphics people to make our campaign really professional. We need support. The easiest way to do that is to go on our website, which is www.save, S-A-V-E, then the initials IGHM.org. And if you go in there, you'll get news, you'll get reports, You'll see some of those footage that you've seen earlier. You'll see all the press that we've been getting. And there's a little donate button on there. You hit that and send us a donation. That is supporting this effort, because that's what we're doing, is we're supporting the effort until we get Quinnipiac to partner with us, and then we will bring in a whole other level of commitments and support and pledges. But right now, we do need donations to continue.
Absolutely.
The work.
You know, it's, I think the museum opened in September of 2012. Years. It's not, it's only a slight exaggeration to say that should Quinnipiac decide, okay, let's move forward, that we could have the museum open by St. Patrick's Day. And again, I keep coming back to this, but it's just so, I think it's a tragedy that all of that marvelous art is sitting behind locked doors.
Yeah, we're concerned about that. You know, being art, we're concerned because of temperatures and all that good stuff.
Of course. I will end on words that, Turla, I believe were from you, which is this art needs to speak. So I am so pleased to have had both of you on Arts Respond on WNHH Community Radio today. Joe McDonough and Turla McConnell, excuse me about that. I had a swallow get stuck in my throat. I want to thank both of you so much for taking part of your beautiful Friday afternoon with me here on the radio. I appreciate both of you, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much.
Truly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.